Welcome back to Fundamentals in Ecology. My name is Umesh Srinivasan and I am at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. And today in Fundamentals in Ecology, what we're going to look at is community ecology. We're going to start looking at community ecology. If you remember, our definition of communities is that it is a set of populations of multiple species that are present at a particular place in a particular time. So, what are communities, right? There are many definitions of communities, and there are many definitions generally in community ecology of multiple terms and multiple concepts. But when it comes to a community, so the broadest definition of a community is that it is a group of actually or potentially interacting organisms, which is all of those are also interacting with the environment. And so what you have is a set of populations, the number of organisms that belong to different species, and all of them form populations. Every set of individuals in a particular species forms a population, and then a set of populations in which organisms, individuals, can or are actually interacting with each other and are interacting with the environment. That is broadly the definition of a community. Now, communities are bound by space and time. So, those organisms that can or are actually interacting with each other have to be in a particular space, in a particular time. So, it's very obvious to most of us that as we go from one particular location to another, so let's say you're going from a rainforest to a desert, that the set of species that is present in the rainforest is very different from the set of species that is present in the desert. What is slightly less obvious is that even within the rainforest, if you look at the set of populations that co-occur today versus the set of populations that can co-occur 100 years from today, that set of populations can be very different from each other. So, not only are communities bound by space, they are also bound by time, in that communities can change in the same location over time. Now, you've got multiple populations of multiple species interacting with each other, and those interactions lead to properties of the community, patterns that we can actually measure. So, you could have, for example, multiple plant species competing with each other for the same resources like nitrogen, and then what is the outcome of that competition is that different plant species then have different abundances or different population sizes, because some are better competitors, some are poorer competitors. And so the better competitors that can access and can compete better for nitrogen then end up having larger population sizes than species that are not as good as competing for nitrogen. And there are multiple ways, multiple interactions of species with their environment, multiple interactions of species with each other. All of those complex interactions then end up creating a community that has certain properties in terms of the presence or absence of certain species and the abundances of those species. Communities can vary from being very simple to being very, very complex. So, if you look at an alpine meadow, for example, you might have only 2 species of plants, a handful of species of pollinators, maybe 1 or 2 species that are grazing on these alpine meadows. So, you have a small number of species, and because you have a small number of species, the potential number of interactions between those species is also small, right? But you can go to another extreme where if you look at a coral reef, a tropical coral reef, that can have thousands of species of coral, it can have thousands of species of fish, invertebrates, and so on, other species associated with. So the potential number of interactions between those species is very high, and that's a very complex community. So communities can vary in their complexity from being simple to complex. Now that we've described what a community is and we've looked at some of the properties of different communities, what is community ecology? What is the field of community ecology? Community ecology is the study of patterns in ecological communities and the mechanisms that underlie those patterns. And so if you look at a community and you say, here is a community where there are 100 species, of those 100 species, 10 species are very common, 90 species tend to be rare. That is a pattern that you're observing in the community. And then the question is, what is the mechanism that underlies that pattern? Why are these 10 species very, very common? Why are these 90 species rare? That is a question asking what are the processes that then lead to these patterns in communities. And so it's a study of the structure and function of ecological communities. And you can imagine if you go to a tropical rainforest or a tropical coral reef and you want to ask what are all the mechanisms that underlie why, for example, in a tropical coral reef, certain species of fish are very common, other species of fish are very rare. There are many mechanisms underlying that process, underlying that pattern, right? There could be competition between fish species. There could be one fish species actually facilitating another fish species, or there could be mutualisms or symbiosis between fish species. All of these fish species are then interacting with the environment in a certain way. And so you've got all this complexity, all these multiple patterns, multiple processes underlying the pattern that you see. And so if you describe community ecology as the study of pattern and process, what are the processes underlying the patterns that you see, community ecology ends up being a very ambitious undertaking. You know, it's very difficult to uncover all the processes, all the mechanisms, all the interactions between species in complex communities. And so what community ecologists do is that they reduce or select from that larger complex community, select modules, select subsets of that community which are easier to analyze, which are easier to understand than all of these interactions put together. And so often what community ecology does is that it deals with analytically easy to analyze modules. And much of community ecology deals technically with assemblages rather than dealing with communities. So what is an assemblage? An assemblage, this is a typical kind of study that you would see as part of community ecology. What you've got on the x-axis is the intensity of logging, which is the intensity at which trees or timber is removed from a forest, and that's measured in terms of meter cubes of wood being taken out per hectare from a forest. What you've got on the y-axis is relative species richness. So at a logging intensity of 0, which means that there is no logging actually happening, you have a certain number of species of mammals, of amphibians, of invertebrates and of birds, and you're asking relative to that baseline number of species, if you increase logging intensity, how does species richness change? How does the number of species change? So what you've got is a baseline of 100%. That's the number of species that is present in primary forest that has never been disturbed, never been logged, versus if you increase the intensity of timber removal, how does species richness change? And what we're seeing here is that mammal species richness declines very sharply with even small amounts of logging increasing. Amphibian species richness also declines very sharply with small amounts of logging, whereas for invertebrates and for birds, the number of species does not change as much as it does for mammals and invertebrates. So what we're dealing with here, if we're saying mammals and we're saying mammal species richness drops, or we're saying the mammal community loses species very fast with even small increases in disturbance, what we're talking about is a taxonomically defined group. We're saying mammals are a taxonomically defined group, invertebrates are a taxonomically defined group, amphibians and birds are taxonomically defined group, right? But the mammals are not just interacting with each other, they're also interacting with other species in their environment which are outside their taxonomic group. So the elephant that you're seeing over there is obviously not just interacting with, for example, other elephants or other mammals, but it's also interacting with plants, it's also interacting potentially with predators. And so where you've got this community, and the community is not taxonomically defined, it's all the species that are present in that location at that particular time that can or do interact with each other. What we're dealing with here is the assemblage of mammals, the assemblage of amphibians, the assemblage of invertebrates, and the assemblage of birds, which is now taxonomically defined. And this is very common. You will very often see studies that deal with one particular taxonomically defined group, like birds, for example. And so very often when we say community ecology, we're often dealing with assemblages of taxonomically defined groups. And within these assemblages, you have guilds. This is a very common way in which ecologists divide or define species based on some important property, ecological property of those species. In this case, this is diet, and this what is happening here is that you want to understand what is the survival rate, and that's on the y-axis, what is the survival rate of a species from one year to the next. So you're asking what is the probability of an individual surviving from one year to another, and what is that, how does that probability change in small fragments of forest versus large fragments of forest. So you've got forests that are that have high that have large sizes, and you can have forest patches that are small, and you're asking how does the probability of an individual surviving from one year to the other change, whether that individual depending on whether that individual is found in a small fragment or a large fragment. And for some reason we have reason to believe that the diet of the species, what the species eats, changes the way in which it can or cannot survive in large fragments versus small fragments. So what is happening here is that we've broken down that larger assemblage of birds into dietary guilds, and we're asking for frugivores that eat fruit versus nectarivores that feed on nectar, is the pattern of survival in large and small fragments different from what it is for insectivorous species that eat arthropods. And so these now are dietary guilds. Within that guild of terrestrial insectivores, you have a set of species that share some important property. And that important property for terrestrial insectivores is that they all feed on arthropods, and that they feed on or close to the ground, and they don't go up into higher levels in the vegetation. And that property, we think, is something important in differentiating the way in which they might respond to habitat fragmentation from frugivores, for example. So these are guilds within a community. Members or species within a certain guild share some important property that changes the way in which they might interact with their environment and with other species. So this is an example of a dietary guild. It need not be diet. You could ask, for example, what is the guild of species that nests in tree cavities? That need not be taxonomically restricted. You could say you have a set of monitor lizards, squirrels, parakeets, all of which need tree cavities to reproduce. And that would be the guild of cavity nesting species. And so you could say, I have reason to believe that cavity nesting species as a guild would be more or less vulnerable to a certain alteration in the habitat than a set of species that does not need cavities to nest in. When we're talking about communities, we often talk about community structure. How is this community structured? So if I went into this community of birds in the eastern Himalayas, in Arunachal Pradesh in India, and I look at all of these species that are present at a particular location, I can ask multiple questions about how this community is structured. I can ask how many species are there in this community. So what is the species richness of this community? And we will talk about how species richness or species diversity is measured in this community, in communities, in a subsequent session. I can ask which are the species that are found here, which are the species that are found at 2000 meters above sea level, and which are the species that are not found here. I can ask what are the functional guilds of these species, how many insectivores are there, how many frugivores are there, how many species are there that feed on nectar. So I can look at the functional distribution of traits of these species in the community. I can then ask how are the abundances of these species, the population sizes of these species distributed. So I can ask about things like commonness and rarity. Why are certain species common? Why are other species rare? I can ask about the diversity of the community in terms of diversity and evenness, in terms of asking what is the distribution of population size in this community. So if I just created a frequency histogram of the abundances of these species in this community, I can ask, is that distribution of abundances, is it even, meaning are most species similar in terms of their population sizes to each other, or is this distribution of abundances uneven, where some species are extremely common, other species are very, very rare. And then I can compare communities. I can say, here is a community of birds at 2000 meters above sea level, here is a community of birds at 1000 meters above sea level, and I can ask which community is more species rich, which community is more even, what are the patterns of commonness and rarity between these two communities, and how do they differ, or how are they similar. One of the criticisms of community ecology, and one of the most that criticism by John Lawton in 1999 was that if you look at the scale of ecology, and we've talked about this, we're going from individuals to ecosystems, John Lawton says that at the individual scale, if you look at individuals and their behavior, or if you look at populations and the ways in which population size changes, things are far more predictable than at the scale of communities. There are general laws regulating how populations work. There are general laws determining how individuals interact with each other and interact with their environment. On the other hand, community ecology, John Lawton says, is a mess, because if you look at processes and patterns of one community and you try to explain how that community is structured, you are asking what are the mechanisms underlying this community, and then you say, okay, I understand this community, I understand the processes that structure this community, and I look at another community, it could be completely different processes that are structuring that that community. And so John Lawton says that there are no laws in community ecology. It is complicated. And so it's very difficult to find generalizable laws in community ecology, is John Lawton's argument. So therefore, understanding one community and the manner in which one particular community works does not necessarily make it easier for us to understand how another particular community works. A lot of this has to do with the fact that community ecology traditionally was operating on looking at interactions between two particular species, and therefore the interaction between those two particular species might not be the same as the interaction between two other particular species. But Daniel Simberov, in his 2004 address to the Society of American Naturalists, says that yes, community ecology might have very few general laws, and that community ecology communities and the way in which communities are structured differ from place to place and from time to time, and therefore it's difficult to find generalizable laws. But that does not mean that community ecology is a weak science. In fact, Daniel Simberov says community ecology is a very exciting field of science with a growing understanding of what the mechanistic underlying mechanisms of community patterns. And it's important that we don't abandon community ecology because first, does community ecology not really have general laws? It turns out that depending on how you look at communities, you can find general laws that operate across all communities. Second, is the worth of any particular kind of science dependent on whether you do find general laws or not? And that's related to the third point, which is especially now today with things like climate change and habitat fragmentation and forest loss. We still need to study communities because we need to understand how those communities are interacting with their environment and populations interacting with each other, so that we can come up with meaningful measures in terms of conservation. So even if a community in a polar region operates very differently from a tropical community, if I need to conserve a polar community and a tropical community, I still need to understand how those communities work. And so therefore, community ecology is a valuable science. One of the ways in which people have said, can we generalize mechanisms in community ecology, is to say, let's start talking about species in terms of their functional traits. For example, I can say, here is a hummingbird. It is 10 grams in weight, so its body size is a certain value, and it feeds almost exclusively on nectar. And so therefore, these properties of this hummingbird, regardless of what the identity of that species is, the properties of the species, the traits that that species has, is important in determining how that species interacts with its environment and how that species interacts with other species. So the focus, if we turn our focus to these functional traits, turn our focus to the properties of these species, then we can ask, how is the fundamental niche of the species, which is where can this species even occur? And we will talk in more detail about functional niches and realized niches. How is the functional niche governed by the functional traits of this species across abiotic gradients? So if you've got a gradient of temperature, let's say you're looking at a gradient across elevation, so you have low elevation to high elevation, you can ask, how would a 10-gram nectar feeding bird, would it be more likely to occur at low elevations or high elevations, just given the properties that it has, just given the physiology that it has. And so how do the traits of species determine where they are found, for example, on some abiotic gradients? And then you can ask, if you've got a species that has certain traits, how is it going to potentially or actually interact with other species that have certain traits? And so you're asking, based on just the properties of the species, this species could be found from, hypothetically, from 500 meters to 1500 meters above sea level. But it's only found from 500 meters to 1000 meters above sea level. So the fundamental niche of the species is 500 to 1500 meters above sea level. But the realized niche where it is actually found is 500 to 1000 meters above sea level. So the realized niche is smaller than the fundamental niche. And that could be the outcome of biotic interactions, interactions between species. And those interactions and how those interact, like competition or predation, how those interactions actually influence performance. So a species might be able to compete better at 500 to 1000 meters above sea level, and therefore it is still found at 500 to 1000 meters above sea level. It could potentially be found between 1000 and 1500 meters above sea level based on its properties, based on its traits. But because it is perhaps not as good as a competitor for relative to other species between 1000 and 1500 meters above sea level, it's not found there anymore. So you can generalize by looking at traits of species. One example here is that hummingbirds, for example, are species that are generally dependent on nectar and vary a lot in body size. And body size is a very important trait, a functional trait of these hummingbirds, because it determines, body size determines how fast species metabolize nectar. And body size also determines things like costs of flying, maintaining body temperature, and so on. Across an elevational gradient, the densities of flowers is what determines whether these hummingbirds can or cannot be found in a particular location, because hummingbirds have to have flowers to be able to feed. And so that defines their fundamental niches, and flower densities vary across elevational gradients, altitudinal gradients. Large size being bigger also means that in the hummingbird assemblage, you're a better competitor, because larger size species can afford or can actually chase away smaller species from flower resources, from nectar resources. But larger size means that you also need more flowers, you need more nectar. Therefore, if you look at territories of hummingbirds, certain territories will not be able to even support a large species, because they might not have enough flower and nectar resources. And so all of these things put together can predict the altitudinal or the elevational distribution of hummingbirds. And now that we're looking at the distribution of resources, and we're looking at the distribution of body sizes, and we're able to predict at low elevations, if you have high flower densities and high flower resource, the hummingbird community should look like this based on the body size distributions of those hummingbirds. Whereas if you go to higher elevations and the flower resources look different, then the hummingbird community should look different. And now this is no longer limited to saying hummingbirds and nectar. You can actually then generalize and say, let's look at arthropods as a resource and insectivorous birds as a resource, as the species that are feeding on this resource. And then those laws that govern the way in which hummingbirds are interacting with their environment and their resources should also be applicable to the way in which insectivorous birds are interacting with their resources and their environment. And so now you've moved one step further, and instead of saying this particular hummingbird species feeds on this particular plant species, we've moved on to saying this hummingbird has a certain body size. This hummingbird, because of its body size, requires this kind of this amount of resource, and that is then applicable to another species that does not feed on nectar anymore, feeds on something else. And you do actually see general laws in ecology. You do actually see, for example, species area curves. The greater the area, the more the number of species there will be, and that species area curve follows what's called a power law. So you've got species richness S related to area A based on two constants C and Z, and it's remarkable how across taxonomic groups, across different places, different locations on Earth, actually the values of C and Z are very similar across taxonomic groups and across locations. And so that follows a power law function where as area increases, species richness also increases until it reaches an asymptote. And if you just convert that to the log scale, that then becomes a linear relationship where the log of species richness is related to the log of C, which is a constant, as well as the log of area A regulated by another constant Z. Wherever you go on Earth, there are more species in the tropics than there are in as you go away from the tropics to higher latitudes. So that example is there on the right side, where you've got the continents of the Americas, North America and South America, as a representation. This is true wherever you go in the world, whether you go to Africa, Asia, any location. And what you've got is that those continents are color coded based on the number of species of birds that you find in any location. So as you're going more towards yellow and red, there are more species of birds. As you go more towards blue, there are fewer species of birds. And you can see that the most number of species of birds are in the Amazon and the Andes. And as you go away from the Amazon and the Andes, the number of bird species reduces. And this is true for almost all taxonomic groups, be it plants, insects, birds, mammals. Maximum species richness is in the tropics, and as you go to higher latitudes, the number of species reduces. There are other patterns that you see. For example, very often if you look at the abundance of species and you actually measured species abundance, and you took that abundance and you converted it to the log of that abundance, very often what happens is that the number of species that has a certain abundance on the log scale often follows a normal distribution. So that's called a log normal species distribution pattern, and you can see that on the left over here, where if you take the log of abundance or log of density, the log of population size of species, then the number of species which is on the y-axis that has a particular population size follows a normal distribution. You also see things like mass abundance scaling, where large species tend to be rare, small species tend to be common. So if you have body mass on the x-axis on the log scale, and you have abundance on the y-axis also on the log scale, then that the relationship between body mass and abundance follows a linear pattern, where larger species tend to be rarer, have lower abundances, smaller species tend to be more common. And this is again a pattern that we see repeating itself across taxonomic groups, across locations. And so that was just an introduction to community ecology. What we will talk about next time is conditions and resources, conditions being non-exhaustible properties of the environment, things like temperature, things like humidity, and resources being exhaustible properties of the environment, things like nitrogen or food. for example. So thank you and look forward to seeing you next time.